of years, and we were all very sorry at Sean's passing. He was also a committee member of Greaves. So I'd like you all to remember Sean. I'm sure many of you knew him before we started school. Thanks. If I might also draw your attention to a book by Mary Cullen, another member of our committee. It's a book that has been praised widely. We have it for sale in the bookshop at a reduced price. I'd certainly recommend it to you. Telling It Our Way, Essays in Gender History. I don't want to say it's a selection of our life's work, but I just said it. So hopefully you'll all have a look at that and consider buying it. The other thing I just want to mention now, rather than mentioning it tomorrow, is that the social on Saturday night, or Sunday night I should say, not Saturday night, I always say it wrong, is in the Longstone Public House. And we'll be using that as a social venue over the weekend. It's around in Townsend Street. Townsend Street. We'll be using it. Townsend Street is just around the corner. You turn right, you go out the front door, and then walk up to the traffic lights, turn right again, and then cross over the street and go in Townsend Street, and there's a big sign outside the pub. And the social will be upstairs on Saturday, immediately after school. Sunday. I keep saying Saturday for some reason. I'm very sorry. I always make a mess of any day for the social. It's a habit I have. Townsend Street. Alongside. Yeah, big pub up there. Tonight, I'll let Kevin McCorry introduce the session. Kevin is chairing this session. Kevin is a committee member of the People's Movement, and I'm sure is known to very many of you. And I'll hand over to Kevin right now.
Just reiterate the welcome and say that this opening session is to deal with Desmond Greaves, evaluating his life and his historical writings on this centenary of his birth. With two speakers, Priscilla Metcher and Andy Coughlin. Priscilla will deal with Desmond Greaves, the historian, and explore the importance of the life and times of James Connolly for Connolly research. Andy Coughlin will give a political evaluation of Desmond Greaves, and Andy will speak first. Anthony is the Desmond Greaves' literary executor and formerly senior lecturer in social administration in TCD. So without further ado, I'd ask you to welcome Anthony to the floor.
We should ask more on him kind and so on. An Rúnach leerveste bij Baha agus ober Desmond Greaves. Ik nooit ook uit Shaw, Kate Vlian, Thresha Rugage, as an Faircoit Vlian, Thresha on Skull Vlian Tour Shaw of Noon. It's very appropriate that this first session at this centenary of Greaves' birth should be devoted to evaluating his work, and I see him as particularly important in relation to three areas. He had a significant influence, I believe, on modern Irish history, particularly in relation to the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland. Second, he's well known as a historian, the author of three important biographies. And thirdly, I believe probably the most significant long-term influence of Greaves is as a person who thought about and practiced in his political practice relating to the national question, which is a very big issue today. Desmond Greaves, like Connolly before him, was a Marxian socialist. I remember once asking him how would he define socialism, and he said, socialism would be a society run in the interests of those who worked, working class, or people who sold their labour capacity or labour power. A political definition, rather than one which said it's a mix of public, private or cooperative enterprise. From the time of his political awakening in the 1930s, he was primarily interested, perhaps because of his Irish and Welsh background, though he of course was born, grew up and was educated in Liverpool, going to the university there, but he had these Irish and Welsh connections, and of course Liverpool is close to Wales. And he was primarily interested in issues of colonialism and imperialism, rather than issues of socialist planning or socialism as such. He would say that he regarded himself, and he usually opened up at talks on socialist or national issue by saying I'm speaking from the point of view of socialist internationalism. He believed internationalism was the prime category, and as internationalists one should stand for the independence of nations. So international was not the opposite of aspiration to national independence, but rather complementary to such aspirations. That was very much his political point of view throughout his life, and he was fond of quoting the well-known letter by Friedrich Engels to Kugelmann in the 1880s, where Engels said, there are two countries in Europe which are never more internationalist than when they're most nationalist, namely Poland and Ireland. This was Engels way back in the 1880s. That was Greaves' view on the subject. As a young student in the University of Liverpool at the age of 21 in 1934, he joined the Communist Party of Great Britain and remained in it all his life. The CP in Britain was, of course, the principal organised force of the left that was against partition and in favour of Irish reunification as part of its political programme for decades, unlike, of course, the Labour Party, not to mind the Tories. And in that sense, Greaves, of course, regarded the CP as an important progressive force. And of course, some of the best elements of the British left were in it. At the same time, he was quite often critical of the failure or inadequacy of the CP leadership in taking the Irish question as seriously as he would have liked it to be taken. So that was generally his attitude in that area. In 1941, he joined the Connolly Club, or Connolly Association as it's now known, which is an organisation of the Irish community in Britain, oriented very much to Labour and the left in Britain. That was 41. In 48, after the war, the monthly newspaper of the conversation, Irish Democrat, was on its last legs and was about to fold up under the editorship of Frank Campbell, and Desmond Greaves became full-time editor. And 3 years later, in 1951, he wasn't full-time editor initially, but in 1951 he went full-time on a very modest salary, the modest wage which the Irish Democratic Conversation could afford, giving up a very well-to-do, affluent job as chief research chemist for one of Britain's leading industries. And he remained editor of the Irish Democrat for subsequent 40 years, from 1951 until his death in 1988. He regarded going full-time in this capacity as the kind of mature second choice which he believed revolutionaries had to make in deciding as adults on the basis of some experience to continue the revolutionary or radical idealism and impulses which animated their youthful years. In the 1950s, as the guiding political brain of the Connolly Association, Greaves advanced the view that the way to a political solution of the Irish problem, the partition problem, was to discredit Ulster Unionism in Britain through exposing the discriminatory practices which occurred under the Stormont regime in Belfast, in the process winning sympathetic allies for the cause of Irish unification in the country that had legislated partition into existence, namely in Britain. This perspective was embodied in a new constitution which he drafted for the Connolly Association in 1955 and which still governs the association today, which of course is still in existence. And between 1955 and 1970 there followed a 15-year-long campaign of educational propaganda directed mainly at the British Labour and Trade Union movement, which did much to ensure that when, in 1968, the civil rights agitation got going in the 6 counties itself, that British Labour, substantial sections of British Labour and trade union opinion, and MPs in the House of Commons and so on, were behind the nationalist rather than the unionist cause. And this was really a kind of big change, because you remember that in 1949, immediately after, or shortly after the end of World War II, the Attlee-led Labour government had passed the Ireland Act, which said there should be no change in the constitutional position of the North of Ireland without the consent of the Northern Ireland Parliament, the Stormont Parliament, and this was regarded by the Unionists as their guarantee. But 20 years later, there were very large elements of the British Labour Party and trade union opinion that was quite opposed to unionism, realised that the nationalist Catholic population were deeply discriminated against, and had a different attitude, and that was a very important source of pressure on the Harold Wilson government in the late 60s and early 70s, which kind of paralleled the pressure that came from the civil rights movement itself in the 6 counties. And in that sense, I think it's fair to regard Desmond Greaves as the intellectual progenitor of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, for it was he who pioneered the idea of a civil rights campaign as the way to split, divide and subvert Ulster unionism, which of course was historically what happened. The idea, I mean, obviously the movement of the North of Ireland was crucial in that process, but the whole idea, I think, significant elements of the idea came from Greaves. And this, I think, is an aspect of the Northern Civil Rights Movement's history which has got relatively little attention from historians. There's been a library of books on the North in the last 30 years during the armed struggle period of the provisional movement and so on, and some studies on the civil rights movement, but they've usually paid quite inadequate attention, in my opinion, to the solidarity movement in Britain, which was not only from the Colonial Association, but of course the Colonial Association was affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties and the Movement for Colonial Freedom, which were very influential movements and organisations in British labour and left-wing circles in those days. So there was a really big movement in the late 50s and throughout the 60s influencing British labour opinion, which was one of the factors was pressing Harold Wilson for reform when the civil rights proper came on the scene in the 6 counties. Also, of course, Greaves had considerable personal influence on some of those associated with the foundation of the civil rights movement. A lot of influence of Betty Sinclair, who of course was secretary of the Belfast Trades Council on the original committee of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association set up in 1967. He had a lot of influence on Jerry Fitt in his early days. The first meetings that Fitt spoke at in Britain were organised by the Colonial Association. And of course, during the 1960s, he was coming frequently to Ireland to do research for his biography of Connolly, of Mellows, Ian Mellows. And that time he met Conall Goldie and Sean Garland and a number of the people in the pre-split Republican movement. And I would say his principal influence on the Republican movement was largely through personal contact of that kind, usually over extensive amounts of booze late at night. The principal influence, I would say, was in dissuading the then united Republican movement from supporting the demand for direct rule when the North exploded in 68-9. Because you remember that after 68-9, the issue became, should the civil rights movement look for direct rule from Westminster and the complete abolition of the 6-county parliament? And the first group that came forward with that view was the far left influenced People's Democracy. They called for abolish Stormont and let's have direct rule from London. That came originally from the PDs, the People's Democracy. Then it was taken up by the newly formed Provisionals after the split in 1970. It ran like wildfire to the Parliamentary Labour Party in Britain, this demand for direct rule. And as Greaves said once, eventually they got direct rule from Edward Heath, the Tory Prime Minister, like a cat being driven into a dairy. And of course, the North experienced the delights and joys of direct rule for the next 25 years. Because Greaves' view was that, you know, a bit like in 1800 when the Dublin Cast administration in the 1790s had made itself so unpopular with public opinion here that people welcome rule from London and the abolition of the College Green Parliament and direct rule from London. They had it for the next 120 years. It was a bit analogous to that. And Greaves put forward the view that the more sensible course was a Bill of Rights for the North to be legislated by the Supreme Parliament in Westminster, which would prevent the Stormont Parliament from doing bad things, discriminating and all the rest of it, and encourage the North of Ireland to come closer to the South over time. This could have been done by the Supreme Parliament of Westminster in the form of a Bill of Rights, which was actually put into the House of Commons, that was thrown out by the Tories. And that became policy of the British TUC and the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, but by the time that had happened, the Wilson administration had been replaced by Edward Heath, who enforced direct rule. And of course, the next 25 years you had direct rule, and you had, like I say, the armed struggle of the provisional movement. And of course, since of course I've got the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement, and I think there are some parallels between Greaves' conception of the Bill of Rights as the way forward with the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement. Of course, he and the Irish government, the Colonial Association, opposed the campaign of the provisional movement, the armed struggle. He said it will not achieve the end desired, it will not achieve a united Ireland. They tried to take on NATO during the Cold War, when it's essential for Britain to have bases in Ireland as part of the Cold War, in case the Cold War became a hot war. It couldn't succeed, and if you couldn't unite Ireland by force, the only other way was to unite it by consent and agreement. And the way to do that was to divide the Unionists, or get a political structure which would over time divide Unionism and win at least a section of Unionist opinion over to recognise the common nationality they had with their Catholic and nationalist fellow countrymen. And that was very much a conception I think is fundamental to the current position. So those are reasons, I think, for regarding Greaves as important as a political activist. As an historian, his biographies of Connolly, Mellows and Sean O'Casey are still widely read. The Connolly and Mellows book are still in print 40 or 50 years after they were both published in 1961 and 1971 respectively. The Life and Times of James Connolly, as Priscilla will be saying, was the biography of the socialist who came to the realization that the establishment of an independent sovereign state was a necessary prerequisite of obtaining a government which would implement socialist measures. You have to have national independence before you can have socialist measures, however those might be defined. Neil Mellows, and he wrote the biography of Mellows as Neil Mellows on the Irish Revolution. Mellows was the radical Republican. As you know, he was executed by the provisional government in 1922. He was the radical Republican who came to realise that it was not enough for an elitist military movement to desire an independent Irish Republic, but that if such a republic were to be attained, the mass of the Irish working people and the labour movement had to be involved and to identify with that goal, work for it and make sacrifices for it. This was kind of the evolution of Liam Mellows. He came to that realisation towards the end of his life. And those are two political themes that come out of those important biographies. And then Sean O'Casey was the Irish writer through whom many on the left in Britain, and indeed in Eastern Europe, when you had, of course, before the collapse in Eastern Europe, many people in Eastern Europe regarded Ireland through the eyes of Sean O'Casey, because his plays were put on all over the place. And as you know, Sean O'Casey, of course, took the view, counterposed national independence and socialism. Sean O'Casey took the view, to express in some of his plays, that Connolly had, so to speak, betrayed or abandoned his socialist views by aligning himself with Pearse and MacDermot and Clark for an independent Irish state in 1916. He counterposed nationalism and socialism, and as Greaves said, it was about as sensible to assess O'Casey as a political theorist as it was to judge James Connolly by his verses. So in his book, Sean O'Casey, Politics and Art, he dealt with those themes. It's now out of print, but we hope to get it at least up on a website before this year is out. His Connolly biography, which appeared in 1961 and which is still basically in print 50 years later, which will also be put up, we hope, on a Greaves Archive website in the next few months. The Connolly biography was well reviewed when it first appeared, no less a person than Roy Jenkins gave a big review to it, and a favourite one in The Observer, if I remember rightly. But the Mellows book, which came out 10 years later, was much less widely reviewed or favourably reviewed, even though Greaves regarded the Mellows book, validly in my opinion, as a much more complex and mature work. It was done 10 years later than the Connolly biography, and it dealt with a more complex period in many ways, the War of Independence and the Civil Rights period. But Greaves commented once, the Connolly book is socialism, he suggested as an explanation, and socialism has as little prospect of being implemented in our part of the world for the foreseeable future. The Mellows book is nationalism, something which is much more dangerous to the powers that be in the era of transnational capital and the European common market. So, those, I think, that's his contribution on the literary and historical side. He made important contributions to labour and Irish national history. But I think it's the third contribution of Desmond Greaves, which I think is possibly in the long run likely to be regarded as the most important or significant, of course. These themes concerned with the national question, the relation between nationalism and socialism, go right throughout all his work, really, all his mature work anyway. I was recently reading a biography of de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, by the French left-wing writer Regis Debray, some of you I'm sure have heard of. And the title of the book was Charles de Gaulle, Futurist of the Nation. Charles, Futurist of the Nation. And from his rather left-wing perspective, Debray was really saying that de Gaulle was a major figure, of course, in historically, and because he was concerned about the national issues in France and more generally. But de Gaulle, of course, came from the right, political right. I think it's fair enough to regard Desmond Greaves in the sense as a futurist of the nation, but coming from the left. In analysing the national questions, Greaves avoided trying to define a nation. A lot of people approach the national question by, here's a definition of the nation, now let's try and fit it to various facts. He regarded this as a kind of the usual academic approach, applying a definition of a nation, and there are various definitions put forward to concrete instances. Greaves rather, and perhaps de Gaulle too, in a different context, took concrete instances, real national problems or national issues, and dealt with their real dynamics. Greaves regarded the approach that began with kind of abstract definitions and tried to fit the facts of the definitions as a form of philosophical idealism, rather than relying primarily on the concrete facts and instances on the ground. And this little pamphlet has just been reproduced, the national question, reproducing two of Desmond Greaves' articles on the national question, which the conversation has just brought out, has the following interesting quotation, which I think is interesting. The academic mind, he says, is addicted to abstractions which, like fire, are useful instruments but dangerous when out of control. For example, what is a nation? Clearly, a nation is a species, a human community characterized by objective features. But there is also a subjective element, frequently the product of a very long history. No two nations are alike. We are therefore dealing with a variable category with uncertain boundaries. If mathematicians can achieve their admired intellectual triumphs through the manipulation of imaginary quantities, which one would think by definition could not be proved to exist, then we humble politicians can be excused for not having a pigeonhole for everything. And that was an interesting quotation. The national questions, of course, are hugely important today, and more obviously this is the case. In our lifetime, my lifetime anyway, the number of states in the world has gone from 60 in 1946 when the United Nations was founded to nearly 200 today, up to 98 I think is the last count. Trebling of the number of nations, of states rather, in the world. Many of these, of course, are multinational states, others are national. But this process clearly not ended. I believe myself that we're probably moving over the next century or so to a world of 300 or 400 states as new states are formed in Africa and South Asia. Who would have said 50 years ago that there'd be a significant move for Scottish independence? Virtually dead, the Scottish nationalism, and 50 years ago, and now we have Scottish Home Rule, and they're talking about a Scottish independence, and which would of course mean the breakup of the British state, a multinational state. And of course only yesterday we read about hundreds of thousands of people in Catalonia wanting independence from the Spanish state. And this is in Western Europe, where people have been trying to work out state boundaries for centuries. I remember Greaves saying once that the left has generally neglected, left-wing theoreticians have neglected the factors making for stable state boundaries. That was one of his comments, which I think has a widespread application. And of course, I would say that his criticism of the common market, now the European Community, European Union, has been very influential and is still very relevant. I remember way back in 1961, one of these civil rights marches the Colony Association organised from Liverpool to London, but I once trudged every bit of the way on. He said, well, the common market, Britain and Ireland and Denmark applied to join the then EEC in 1961. Of course, they didn't get in until 73 because of de Gaulle's veto. He said, this is going to dominate the rest of your political life, and how true that was. But Greaves regarded the European community, later the European Union, as essentially a reorganisation of West European capitalism and the Treaty of Rome as the constitution of an embryonic superstate drawn up in the interest of West European big business without the slightest democratic element in the EC institutions. He believed that membership of the European community, now the European Union, would in due time make the national question, of which of course Ireland has centuries-long experience, the main issue of politics for all the countries of Western and Central Europe that were involved in the European Union, European community, introducing a whole new ball game for the participants in the class struggle of the labour movement as they discovered the drawbacks of having their laws made by people they didn't elect, guided by a constitution which erects laissez-faire, free will of goods, services, capital and labour as the fundamental constitutional principles of the supranational union. As I said at the outset, internationalism, not nationalism, Greaves regarded as the primary category. One could only claim to be an internationalist if one stood for the independence and right to self-determination of the different nations into which humanity is divided. He believed that the weakness of the political left in Ireland and across the European continent was due to its failure to be internationalist in this sense. In Ireland, organised labour has historically left the solution of the national question, the question of the unification of the country, independence vis-à-vis outside forces. Labour has left it historically to the parties of the bourgeoisie and the small bourgeoisie, the middle classes and small middle classes, Fianna Fáil, or else the Republican movement. And then Labour was politically marginalised as a consequence, and of course we see that process with these regular Fine Gael Labour coalitions, of which we're ruled by one at the moment. In England and on the continent, he regarded the labour movement as rotten with chauvinism as a result of sharing the imperialistic assumptions of the traditional ruling classes. It was that labour, on continental labour, or labour in the various continental countries, France, Germany, Italy and so on, was therefore slow to appreciate the loss of democracy entailed by membership of the European Community, European Union. Today, as you know, half or more of our laws each year are made by the supranational institutions in Brussels. Governments, the member governments of the EU, are subject to heavy fines if they don't obey those laws. This state is currently run by the Troika of the ECB, the European Central Bank, the European Commission and the IMF, which descends every 3 months and tells the government what to do. This is hardly the unfettered control of Irish destinies which the men and women of 1916 went out to achieve. It's the very opposite. And yet the likes of Enda Kenny and no doubt Mr. Gilmore will be standing up in 2 years' time prating about 1916 while they'll be laden with fetters. The fetters that come from the Troika and this involvement with European integration and particularly the Eurozone. Greaves regarded the central lesson of Connolly's life, and indeed I would say his own life, as being that the labour and trade union movement, socialists of the left generally, however, need to champion democratic issues as well as conventional left-wing ones. They need to be the foremost campaigners and the best campaigners and the most committed campaigners, the most intelligent campaigners for democratic reforms where democratic reforms are needed. And in countries that have national problems, national independence and in the Irish context, national unity is of course the fundamental democratic issue still. And if Labour and the left don't champion those issues, well, and they'll be championed by political forces from the right. And this, I think, is very vividly illustrated by some current European trends as in relation to the European Union. It tends to be forces from the political right rather than the left, at least have more influence in places like Britain or Germany or Finland and France and so on today rather than forces of the left. And it's because of that, in Greaves' judgment, the left tended to be marginalised, reduced in importance, and national sentiment, national opinion tended to be taken over by the forces of the right because of the sins of omission, sins of failure, so to speak, or political sins of failure of the left. The implication of this particular outlook, which Greaves regarded as the final outlook of Connolly when he took part in the 1916 Rising, it was his own outlook, and regarded as essentially the outlook of Marx and Engels in their day when they came to look at the Irish question. And of course they wrote extensively on Irish matters in the late 19th century. He regarded, the outlook was that in the modern context, the application of this outlook means, I suggest, that the labour movement, socialists on the left, need to put opposition to the European Union and defence of the democratic nation state, which the EU seeks to erode, at the heart of their political campaigning. This is the only way that forces of the left or labour movement can establish political hegemony over the nation as a whole and establish governments that will implement measures making for a rational and humane society. So this, I suggest, is the central theme and message of Desmond Greaves' political work and writings, and clearly it's of widespread contemporary relevance, not only in Ireland, but indeed across the European continent and perhaps more widely. I trust, therefore, that these remarks, looking at Greaves as an activist, mentioning his achievements as an historian, and as a theorist and practitioner of political activity in relation to the national question, show the continued political relevance of Desmond Greaves's life and work. These comments are elaborated on in this little pamphlet that I was asked to do some years ago after Desmond Greaves's death by the Irish Labour History Society, and there are copies of that, of this little pamphlet here, which I think some of you have already got, and there's 50 or 60 copies there, so you're welcome to take them free, grants them or nothing, but they're worth, which elaborate on these remarks in more detail. So I've got a meal among them.
The next speaker is Priscilla Metcher. Priscilla was born and reared in Belfast. She was educated in Queen's. After she finished in Queen's, she taught for a number of years in Methodist College. But she's lived in Germany since 1971. She got her doctorate at Bremen University in 1984. And her work on James Connolly and the reconquest of Ireland. Many of you, is it still available?
Yes.
Copies out.
Outside, it's an excellent study in which he reminds us that the role of Connolly within the Irish struggle. Also, that Connolly was one of the first theoreticians of the labour movement to actually come from the working class, and what Tony had been saying there, his intellectual legacy makes an outstanding contribution to the socialist understanding of the national question. Other works by her, as a study, a longer work, Republicanism and Socialism in Ireland, is a study of the development of ideas, the origin, content and function within social movements, going back to the Jacobin tradition that was strong within the United Irishmen and taken right the way through to Connolly, and is an excellent study. Again, a special emphasis on our works is placed on the idea of James Connolly within the context of the Second International. That was his life was contemporaneous with the life of the Second International. She has also written essays on the Ireland, her own, the radical tradition in the 19th century, and a brilliant little essay she did on Mary Ann McCracken, the indefatigable sister of Henry Joy McCracken, which is a joy to read as an essay. So I would ask you to please welcome Priscilla.
To everybody. My theme this evening is to give, or to try at least, to give an historical evaluation of Desmond Greaves' biography, The Life and Times of James Connolly. Okay. Well, it won't be possible here, of course, to give anything like a complete assessment of what has been written on and about Connolly prior to and after the publication of Greaves' biography. But perhaps my assessment can be added to by contributions from the audience later on. Now, one of the earliest appreciations of Connolly's role in the Irish labour movement is given by W.P. Ryan in his book on the Irish labour movement in 1919. That's just 3 years after the Easter Rising. And it takes us from the early days of labour in Ireland in the 19th century, a theme which also James Connolly wrote about in his Labour in Irish History, which was published in 1910. But Ryan gives us perhaps a more detailed account. And almost half of the book is dedicated to Connolly, whereas Ryan is especially interested in the relationship between socialism, republicanism, Sinn Féin and the Gaelic League. It's not really a biography in the real sense, but it does take us through the different periods of Connolly's political activities and writings. Generally speaking, he sees no evolution in Connolly's teaching because he believes that all in his writings and speeches was explicit or implicit in the programme of the Irish Socialist Republican Party of 1896. But it was important to Ryan to show why Connolly the socialist should have participated and played a leading role in the Easter Rising. Now, the first full-scale biography was written by Desmond Ryan, who, by the way, was also the editor of the first collections of Connolly's published writings under the title Socialism, Nationalism, the Workers' Republic, and Labour and Easter Week. And these are probably known to a number in the audience. From the outset, Ryan speculates that Connolly's position would be that of the official Irish Labour Party, that is, of course, of the 1920s, and that he would have seen the Irish Free State as a step towards the cooperative Commonwealth. But I think it would be difficult to assume that Connolly would have been in favour of a free state as it emerged after the Civil War, for he was always strictly against partition. But Ryan's aim, however, I think is laudable as he sets out to remove some of the mists which even yet, he says, obscures the real greatness of an outstanding figure of the 20th century. Insinuating, I think, that Connolly was indeed revered as a leader of the Easter Rising, but his socialism ignored. Ryan says quite clearly, James Connolly was a Marxian socialist. He was widely read in the literature of socialism, and he places special emphasis on Connolly's ideas of industrial unionism, which he maintains occupied his thoughts right through to the end. So the biography which follows Connolly through his early years and labour activities, experiences in the USA, and especially the dramatic events of the 1930 lockout and, of course, Easter week, are written to underline these theses. A further biography by Richard Michael Fox sets out again to correct the image of Connolly as national hero. He was the voice of the downtrodden. He says his part of the Easter Rising was the culmination of years of experience and activity in the labour movement. As Fox points out, we cannot get a true picture of the man without realising that his enthusiasm for liberty embraced the claim of Ireland to national freedom and the claim of labour to a free social order. So Fox makes a poignant remark, and I think this is important when looking at Connolly and his political activities and ideas. Whereas most of his contemporaries in the international labour movement were concerned with issues of economic justice for workers, Connolly had, of course, a more complex task, for these issues were tied up with the fact that Ireland had been denied the elementary rights of freedom. So Connolly stand that socialism and nationalism in Ireland belong together. At the same time, Fox also points to Connolly as internationalist. I think this is also a point that Tony also points out when talking about Desmond Greaves. It was Connolly's conviction, Fox writes, that side by side with the national struggle for freedom in Ireland, there must also be an international struggle of the world's workers to achieve a larger freedom. So these are some, of course there are quite a number of other perhaps smaller contributions along this line, but these I think are some of the main biographies which were written before Greaves' biography appeared in 1961. Perhaps I could also mention here that Connolly's private and public life, of course, is given by two of his daughters, Nora Connolly O'Brien, and she writes a very moving portrait, I think, of her father, a socialist leader and family man, And another Connolly daughter, Ina Connolly Heron, published a personal account of the Connolly family's fortunes and misfortunes, and these were published in Liberty in the 1960s. Another personal account of Connolly is given by Cathal O'Shannon, someone who actually worked along with Connolly. And the first article was written by O'Shannon when he was interned in Reading Jail after the Rising. That was in fact 4 months after Connolly's execution in September the 9th. And in it, O'Shannon sets out to explain why Connolly, the socialist, should have taken up arms in Easter week. On nothing, he says, throughout his whole life did he insist with greater strength and clarity than the identity of Irish political independence with industrial revolution and social freedom. To him, these were not two, but one and indivisible. They were his republic and commonwealth. Well, so now we come to Desmond Greaves' biography. As Tony pointed out, it was first published in 1961. And I would like to begin here with a question, and I hope maybe to provide a few answers. How come that an English Marxist should write two outstanding books on 20th century Irish history? Well, first of all, and this is also something that Tony referred to, that Greaves had personal connections with Ireland. His family came originally from the north of Ireland, and they used to go on summer holidays there to Newcastle, County Down, when Greaves and his sister were children. And secondly, there is a tradition within the left in Britain of interest in Ireland and the national question, going back even as far as the beginning of the 19th century. I'm thinking here of the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was then aged 19, who wrote an address to the Irish people, which was published in 1812. And he says in somewhat emotional language, "Ireland, thou emerald of the ocean, thou art the isle on whose green shores I have desired to see the standard of liberty erected, a flag of fire, a beacon at which the world shall light the torch of freedom." Marx and Engels were both, of course, deeply interested in the Irish question. Engels, by the way, lived with an Irish woman who supported the Fenian cause, and Marx's daughter, Eleanor, was married to Edward Aveling and was involved in the amnesty movement for Fenian prisoners. And it was Marx's mature opinion itself, by breaking, he said that the English working class could only emancipate itself by breaking Britain's connection with Ireland. One, I think, can also mention the English Marxist historian T.A. Jackson, whose book on Ireland was edited by Desmond Greaves, and who once said T.A. Jackson was the greatest Irishman to come out of England. But Jackson was, to Greaves' disappointment, rather an exception among the British left at that time. And Greaves was interested, of course, above all in the national question and issues of colonialism and imperialism. So his main drive was to convince British socialists to support the ongoing struggle for Irish independence. In the 70s, he actually complained about the policy of the British Communist Party on the general national question, which he described as wretched. He said they're not interested in the Irish question, bless your heart, but in what will get members for their organisation. So both the life and times of James Connolly and Liam Mellows on the Irish Revolution were written with this in mind. Originally, Greaves had planned to write a history of the Irish Revolution, which he submitted to the left-wing publisher Lawrence and Wisher. But they said it was too long. Then, as Desmond Greaves puts it, an inspiration came to me while walking across a bog in Scotland. Divided into two, making the first part the life of Connolly and the second part the life of Mellows. So that was the origin of my Connolly biography. Well, Tony has pointed out that Greaves was of the opinion that the Mellows book was of more greater maturity than the Connolly book. Of course, that is Greaves' own private opinion, but again, the books, of course, are very different, of a very different nature. The Connolly book, of course, dealing with socialism, and the other one with Irish nationalism, which Greaves said was very dangerous. Yes, so it is interesting, I think, that Greaves gives a lot of detail, which he mingles with Connolly's political activities and with interesting information concerning the economic situation at the time. So in dealing, for example, with the period before 1896, that is before Connolly actually came to Ireland, we are given details about the situation in Britain generally, which was of course a period of industrial depression and agrarian crisis. The land question, of course, being of the utmost importance in Ireland. At the same time, he sums up the development of socialism in Scotland and Connolly's early socialist activities there. And is at pains to point out that Connolly was actually familiar with developments in Ireland, the activities, for example, of the Land League, Parnellism and so on, before settling in Ireland. Again, the part of the biography dealing with the period of Connolly's sojourn in the USA, that was 1903 to 10, begins with a short survey of the development of American capitalism and the corresponding growth of labour organisations there. So, background information on the situation, whether it's economic or political, of the times is essential to Greaves to underline the problems that confronted Connolly, but also, I think, to reveal the various influences on the development of his political thought. Greaves' biography, by the way, is by no means lacking in humour. A good example, I think, concerns the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria and the anti-Jubilee demonstration which was organised by the Irish Socialist Republican Party. And I would like here perhaps just to give a short quote which gives you an idea as to how Desmond Greaves puts the whole situation over. A rickety handcart had been draped in the semblance of a hearse and was being pushed by a member of the Irish Socialist Republican Party. Maud Gonne and William Butler Yeats joined the procession and quickly distributed their black flags. They all moved solemnly down Dame Street to the sound of the Dead March. As soon as the police realised what was happening, reinforcements were rushed from the castle. Baton charges began to disperse the dense throng of spectators. Connolly, at the head, had reached O'Connell Bridge when the fighting became exceptionally fierce. It became clear that the procession could not cross the bridge. With a flash of inspiration, he ordered the coffin to be thrown into the Liffey, and the whole crowd took up in chorus his valedictory words, "Here goes the coffin of the British Empire, to hell with the British Empire." Connolly was arrested and spent the night at the Bridewell. Maud Gonne sent him his breakfast, paid his fine when he appeared in court, and he was released. Well, that gives you perhaps a little inkling as to the sort of style that Greaves also used in his book. Now, Greaves sees clearly a progression through three phases in Connolly's thought, which he says, the first being social democratic, the second broadly syndicalist, and the third foreshadowing some of the most modern concepts of scientific socialism. The book can thus be divided into three parts, corresponding to the three stages in Connolly's political development. Before his tour of the USA in 1902-3, which ends the first phase, Greaves sums up his political position. He says, the stress was on political action, emphasis on the importance of building up a working class party, and on the power of the vote. Commenting on this first phase of Connolly's political career, Greaves writes, his failure to stir a lasting mass movement was due not to his own immaturity, but to the immaturity of objective conditions. He was ahead of his time, not behind it. The second phase, covering Connolly's stay in the United States, is dominated by his theory of industrial unionism, brought about by his activities as organiser of the Industrial Workers of the World, popularly known as the Wobblies, which was founded in Chicago in 1905. It was an organisation of the unskilled workers as answer to the growth of huge trusts. The emphasis is now on industrial struggle, the one big union being the embryo of the future government of the Republic of Labour. And Greaves, of course, as Marxist, comments on Connolly's position here. He says he did not distinguish between a fully developed socialism and a transitional stage. He lacked the conception of a government of the people and consequently of the role of the working class party in achieving this. Connolly never really fully relinquished his views on industrial unionism, and I think they are also reflected in the significant role he designated to the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in the period up to the Easter Rising. So in the last phase of his career, in 1910 to 16, Connolly emphasises the importance of both industrial and political action. According to Greaves, his syndicalism becomes slightly subdued, but the transition to socialism was still seen as economic pressure compelling political changes rather than the other way round, that is, state power compelling economic changes. But with the outbreak of war in 1914, Greaves considered that Connolly was moving towards a mature position in his political thought. He writes his mental picture was that of a democratic revolution to put an end to the imperialist war in Irish conditions taking a national form. Connolly's reference to the first days of freedom, Greaves interprets as recalling Lenin's approach in two tactics. That is, the coming revolution in Ireland was to be a people's revolution, leading to a popular republic. But he points out Connolly was virtually alone in possession of this perspective. He stresses that had Connolly been able to leave behind him a scientific socialist party, it's possible that 1918 to 22 would have seen the completion of the struggle for Irish independence. Now, since the publication of Greaves' biography, there are, of course, a number of other biographies which have been published, and also writings on Connolly's thought. I haven't much time to go into detail here, but it suffices perhaps to mention some further biographies and to make a few comments on subsequent publications on Connolly's thought. First of all, there are those publications I would consider myself to be rather a regression. They're written, well, from an anti-Marxist point of view, refuting Greaves' standpoint and interpretation. In his biography, the American writer Samuel Levinson stresses his interest in the individual person rather than the working class thinker, and so he separates Connolly's actions as an individual from a socialist thought. He attempts a psychological interpretation, seeing flaws in Connolly's personality due to what he terms psychological drives. Ruth Dudley Edwards, while herself taking freely from Greaves' book, writes that his Stalinism makes his interpretation suspect. But I think she hardly adds anything of interest. There are, of course, a number of other writers, such as Owen Dudley Edwards, who puts forward, I suppose, the enlightened Catholic point of view. And here I would also like to mention that Manus O'Riordan has done some valuable research on Connolly, especially concerning Connolly and the USA. Then there are those who would take, I would say, an ultra-left stand when writing on Connolly's political thought. In his book, Austin Morgan poses the question why a man who lived as a socialist died an Irish nationalist. And Morgan works on the assumption that Connolly had feet in two very different movements, international socialism being alien to Ireland, and militant nationalism cancelling out the idea of internationalism. But this, I think, has already been refuted by Desmond Ryan and R.M. Fox. Morgan judges Connolly, I think, from the high chair of academia, or as Brendan Bradshaw once aptly puts it, places him in the dock and conducts the case for the prosecution. He judges Connolly as not measuring up to something that he never aspired to be, that is, a professional intellectual of the labour movement. The German writer Helga Wodden, in her biography, says that Connolly makes concessions to nationalism at the expense of socialism. She says, with the aid of what she calls hibernicized Marxism, Connolly wanted to create a social revolutionary movement out of nothing and transform nationalism in a socialist manner. But there are some biographies which seriously contribute new material or deal with certain aspects in more detail. Carl and Anne Barton Reeves' biography, this time from the USA, was reviewed by Desmond Greaves in the Irish Democrat. And he writes, the most important result of their inquiry is to uncover the great influence exercised by Connolly on the formative years of the American labour movement. The Reeves make an interesting point on Connolly's scholarship. He was, they write, a highly accomplished, self-educated worker intellectual. And they also quote some interesting words by William E. Bone, who was one of the editors at that time of the International Socialist Review and also a college librarian. And on one day he was strolling over the college campus with Connolly, who remarked to him, "I went to a university once." "Oh, did you?" asked Bone, surprised. "Oh, yes," said Connolly, "I carried cement." So in the university library, they went to the section on Irish history, and Bone comments, "This hod carrier ran his eye over the shelves with the eye of a trained scholar. His commentary on authors, books, and historical characters would be valuable to me now if I were able to reproduce it. One volume after another he took down, and with unerring memory he turned to chapter and page to point out something applicable to the argument we had been having. To one who had spent years trying to teach students to use books, this man's mastery was astounding." And it was not only, I think, his knowledge of Irish history, but Connolly was also very renowned for his quick repartee. There is an example of, when he was giving a speech, I think it was in the States, but I'm not quite sure about this, at a public meeting, someone shouted, "Well, you seem to know a lot about everything. Who's going to win the derby?" And Connolly quickly replied, "A horse." But who would have thought that an ass would ask that question? So I think it's very, showing you quite a lot about how Connolly quickly responded to what people asked. Donald Nevin's 800-page biography, which was subsidised by SIPTU, is constructed on 3 pillars: Connolly's letters, over 200, his writings, and the third being Greaves' biography. And Nevin brings Connolly to life through his own words in a way which no previous biographer had the opportunity of doing. And I think Connolly's letters form a quasi-autobiography. They throw light on aspects of his personality and temperament. Nevin does not make any assessments, but rather places before us various writers' opinions on Connolly. For example, his stand concerning religion, and especially Catholicism. And the second part of the book contains recollections by people such as Louis Bennett, Robert Lind, Cathal O'Shannon, Sean O'Casey, and Desmond Ryan. And part 3 contains assessments on Connolly by various writers, not all of whom shared Connolly's views, but none of whom would deny his significance as a thinker. And finally, I would like to draw your attention to the latest biography on Connolly, which was published last year and written by Larkin Collins. It's part of the O'Brien Press series of biographies of the 16 men executed after the Easter Rising. And it's a very readable biography, making good use of Connolly's correspondence and the minutes of the Irish Socialist Republican Party. It could be read as an addition or supplement to Greaves' biography. The emphasis is not on Connolly's political thought, but it is about Connolly, the political activist, and brings in personal notes on the Connolly family. And in the appendices are two of Connolly's songs of freedom and his long poem, The Legacy, the Dying Socialist to his Son. So in spite of the biographies and works on Connolly's political thought that have been published since the life and times of James Connolly, I think there can be no doubt that Greaves' biography is the classical work on Connolly and his role in socialism and the labour movement. In Table Talk, Desmond Greaves outlines his political creed concerning socialism and nationalism, which is basically James Connolly's own point of view and which is the political message in the life and times of James Connolly. To quote Greaves, the basis of true international cooperation is recognition of and respect for the independence of nations. National independence is the prerequisite of socialism and indeed of every other ism. For how can people get laws they want unless they have a state of their own with the power to legislate them? So this is a message that has even, I think, greater significance today, for not only does the Irish Revolution remain incomplete, but with membership in the EU, Irish sovereignty itself is at stake. Now I'd like to end with a quotation from Lenin, with which Desmond Greaves, I think, would surely agree. The fusion of nations can only come about on a truly democratic basis, which would be impossible without the realisation of self-determination. Thank you very much.
Open it up for a bit of discussion. I think there's a microphone is going to go around. Is that the